Good day. The last 24 hours in this great crisis over Ukraine have seen some rather odd statements and actions by various officials from different countries. The most weird one for me was that of Mr. Reznikov, the Ukrainian defense minister. He has given a number of interviews. Over the course of one, he has said that Ukrainian losses were somewhere short of 100,000, which, as I said, is a somewhat dramatic revelation. Perhaps an even more extraordinary one was a comment he made to CNN in which he denied that Ukraine is preparing a 1 million-man army to take back Kherson region. Then, when it was pointed out to him that he'd said that very thing in an interview he'd given a short time ago to the London Times, he said that it had all been a misunderstanding and that his English isn't especially good. Well, I have to say, I'm going to put aside all discussion about the figures. I don't think we're in any position to say what Ukrainian casualties are in total, though it's clear that they are very high. But the other part, the part about the 1 million-man army going to attack Kherson region, is somewhat extraordinary because, of course, that article appeared in the London Times. It circulated. Many people commented about it. There was all sorts of excited discussions about what Reznikov had told the London Times about this 1 million-man army that was going to attack Kherson region. And this story was allowed to persist for days and weeks. And now we see Reznikov turning round and telling us that it was all a misunderstanding and that he didn't mean what the London Times apparently thought he meant. Now, I'm going to say something else. It's not entirely clear to me whether Reznikov is saying that there's not going to be a counter-offensive in Kherson region or that there isn't going to be a counter-offensive with a 1 million-man army. I've read the CNN article, and I think there's some ambiguity there, but I'm going to put that to one side for a moment. I'm going to assume that so far as Ukraine is concerned, the Kherson counteroffensive is still on. Not just Reznikov, but various other Ukrainian officials have spoken about this counteroffensive. What Reznikov is now saying is that the 1 million-man army idea is really off, that idea of this 1 million-man army, which I never took entirely seriously. Many of the more astute commentators, Larry Johnson, the person who broadcasts as the new Atlas, various bloggers, Russian and indeed Ukrainian bloggers, none of them took it seriously. But anyway, I suspect that particular fantasy has also been, has now finally been dropped. It's simply too absurd to be sustainable. I'm going to say, actually, that this affair with Reznikov and his strange contradictions ought to be another lesson in being extremely careful about assuming that what either side says in the war is necessarily true. But, and I have to say it, it's necessary to be especially careful about what the Ukrainians say about this war. Now, that brings me to the story again of the attack on the officers' club in Vinnytsia. Now, as I discussed, there's been lots of discussion in the West. The Ukrainians have claimed that this was an attack on a civilian facility. I said that the evidence on the contrary, or rather that the Russian claims pointed to the attack having been made against the Army Officers Club in Vinnytsia, which is a military facility. Perhaps not a military facility in the sense of a military base or a, artillery or tank park or something of that kind, but nonetheless a place which is used by soldiers. Now, over the last few hours, I've seen a multiplicity of pictures, some of them, by the way, in the New York Times, which confirm conclusively that the missile strike was primarily against the Officers' Club in Vinnytsia. There are surrounding buildings which have been severely damaged, and it may be, undoubtedly, almost certainly is the case, that civilians were killed as a result of the missile attack on the Officers' Club. And that is a tragedy and a disaster, though unfortunately not one that is that unusual in war. But anyway, the key point is that it's clear that the Officers' Club in Vinnytsia was the target, or at least so it seems to me. I mean, I'm not familiar with the topography of Vinnytsia, but the building that I've seen destroyed, the one that was clearly the target of the attack, is described as the Officers' Club in every photograph that I have seen. And the fact that we're talking about some kind of armed forces facility is further confirmed that by the fact that just outside the Officers' Club there was a sculpture of, well, a MiG-21, a Soviet MiG-21 fighter jet surrounded by some kind of curving object, clearly clarifying the fact that this Officers' Club, that this building was a building which had some connection to the military, and which obviously had that connection from Soviet times, since that looks to me very much like a typical Soviet sculpture. Anyway, putting all that to one side, there's also been some evidence about the people who were killed over the course of this meeting. And I said in my previous program that the Russians had made the really quite remarkable and suggestive claim that the building was targeted because a conference was underway in the building when the missile strike happened, a conference between Ukrainian military officials and representatives of foreign arms suppliers. And apparently the weapon systems that there was some discussion about supplying to Ukraine were some forms of aviation equipment, including possibly aircraft. And I said that this was a dramatic step by the Russians to have taken, because of course it meant that the Russians weren't just killing Ukrainians in this airstrike, they were killing foreigners, presumably Westerners, or at least citizens of the Western Alliance, of NATO, either military people or employees of Western governments, or perhaps Central European and East European, but NATO governments, and perhaps representatives of arms companies, Western arms companies as well. And we've now started to see some trickles of information which go some way to corroborating that claim. There's been some records now of some of the Ukrainian officials who were killed during this missile strike, and it's clear that they were military people, and that one of them, at least, appears to have been identified as an official, a senior officer in the Ukrainian Air Force. In other words, exactly the sort of person you would be expecting to participate in the kind of conference that the Russians say was taking place in this building. Now, in my previous program, I speculated that this was a missile strike carried out in retaliation for the HIMARS missile strike on the warehouse in Kherson region, and that it might have been provoked by evidence, or at least by the Russian belief, that that missile strike, or that Ukrainian missile strikes with HIMARS missiles might have been affected with US involvement. I'm not saying that is true, but that may be what the Russians believe. Well, nothing I've seen about the missile strike in Vinnytsia since I made those claims, published those guesses in my video yesterday, nothing that I have seen contradicts those speculations that I made in that video. They go some way, in fact, to suggesting that they may be true. I'm not saying that it's conclusive, that they are correct, but as I said, it would be consistent with what we now know about the nature of the missile strike. The key point anyway is that the missile strike was clearly against a military target. It was not against a civilian target, even though unfortunately it is highly likely, in fact I accept unequivocally, that civilians were killed, and that was of course a terrible tragedy. There is a difference, and I really want to say this unequivocally, there is a difference between a military strike on a military facility which kills civilians unintentionally, and a missile strike which is indiscriminate and which simply seeks to cause damage, either reckless of whether civilians might be killed, or perhaps intending that civilians be killed. The first, however terrible, is an act of war. The second is potentially a serious war crime. That's all I'm going to say about this, but that brings me again to the topic of the HIMARS missiles. Now, I said a couple of days ago that I'd heard reports that a HIMARS, a complete HIMARS system, together with some of its rockets and missiles, has been sold to the Russians, and that the Russians were in the process of gaining possession of it. Over the course of yesterday, these reports were repeated by sources which I've generally found to be extremely accurate, and who are now claiming that the Russians have now actually taken possession, physical possession, of this HIMARS system, and that they have also managed to obtain some of the ammunition that it uses. Now, I would say that this still falls short of conclusive corroboration, but I think now that there is enough, shall we say, talk about this having happened, talk from reliable sources, that I'm inclined to think that it is probably true. I'm afraid that the Russian Defense Ministry is most unlikely to ever confirm that this is true, at least not to confirm that it is true in any shortened time scale. This is a war after all, and each side wants to keep its secrets. And I'd be astonished if the Ukrainians confirmed it either, given the concerns Western governments have expressed and have been expressing recently, and the concerns which have been appearing in the Western media about leaks of weapons from Ukraine, and about the fact that some of them are now apparently being sold on the dark web. I am going to venture a guess, by the way, that if it is indeed the case, as now seems increasingly likely, that the Russians have gained possession of a complete HIMARS system, then some of these reports we have been hearing about Western concern about arms leaks from Ukraine may be connected with the loss of that HIMARS system. But anyway, it seems very likely now that that story is true. If it is true, then of course it will facilitate the ability of the Russians to gain an understanding of the system, to develop countermeasures, and to find out obviously how it works, and perhaps to reproduce it themselves. And it's not inconceivable that they will, in fact highly likely, that they will share the information that they have found about the HIMARS system with their allies, with their friends, with the Chinese, with the Iranians, with whoever else they want to share that information with. Now, on the topic of the HIMARS, we've received information recently that the United States now intends to supply HIMARS systems to Estonia, and that these will include the 300-kilometer missiles that have so far been denied to Ukraine. Now, Ukraine has been saying that it wants these 300-kilometer missiles. I'm going to express my own opinion, which is an opinion which some Russian bloggers have also expressed, that these missiles, apparently 18 of them, which have been supplied to Estonia, are actually intended for Ukraine, and that the sale to Estonia is actually cover for a sale of these missiles to Ukraine. I've always assumed that sooner or later these sorts of missiles would find their way to Ukraine, and the evidence suggests that that's exactly what is now happening. I don't think this is going to prove the kind of game changer some people think, even though the total number of HIMARS systems, depending on who is doing the counting in Ukraine, now varies between 8 and 18. But anyway, I don't think this is going to prove a, as I said, game changer system. It seems that Ukraine is now also in the process of receiving the tracked version of this system, which is the M270. I understand it doesn't have the ability to launch the 300-kilometer missiles, though maybe it can be adapted to do that, but apparently it's going to receive 9 of them, in which case, on the assumption that Ukraine has been supplied with 18, whether it still has 18 is another matter, 18 HIMARS, together with the 9 systems that it is getting from the West, that means the 27 of these systems will have been supplied to Ukraine in total. And I'm going to venture a guess that this is probably the total number of these systems, these multiple rocket launch systems with this hybrid capability to launch longer range missiles. I suspect that this is the total number of these systems that are going to be sold. 27 plus apparently a third of the US's total arsenal of rockets for these systems. That seems to me to correlate with the numbers, and it seems to me that that is what we now see in the process of happening. If the missile strike on Vinnytsia was a warning from the Russians that this system should not be used to attack Russian territory, then I'm going to say straight away that I doubt very much that this warning will be heeded, despite claims from the US that they've told the Ukrainians not to use this system in that way. And there are, in fact, reports, which I cannot obviously confirm, that some of these HIMARS systems have in fact been detected by the Russians in close proximity to Russian border areas, so as to launch potential strikes into Russia. And that, of course, brings me to another issue, which is a visit that the Russian Defense Minister, General Shoigu, has now undertaken to the battlefronts. He's met with the two commanders, the two battlefield commanders who've been fighting in northern Donbass, General Lapin and General Surovikin. But the important point was that Shoigu said that there needs to be an intensification of operations to secure Donetsk, which has been subject to continuous shelling over the last few weeks, and also to secure Russian territory from Ukrainian strikes. And that may very well be a further Russian response to the supply of the HIMARS systems. It could be that the Russians are now going to reinforce their forces, either with more men or perhaps with more materials, and that they're going to push harder still on the battlefields to push Ukraine further away from the Russian border and from Donetsk city. And this is consistent with the fact that the Russians have now continued apparently incremental advances around Kharkiv, which it's increasingly looking as if they might be intending to surround at some point, to encircle and then invest and then perhaps even storm. And it seems that the Russians may also be preparing some other advances in other places. Which brings me, of course, to what's been going on the battlefields. And the fog of war that I spoke a little about yesterday, on the fighting in northern Donetsk has lifted a little. It seems that the Russians have largely encircled Siversk and control parts of it, that the Ukrainians managed to withdraw a battalion of their troops with its equipment from Siversk further south to reinforce the Ukrainian positions in Soledar, which, as I've said previously, is essentially a suburb of the main Ukrainian city on this last line of defense before the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation is attacked, and that there's now considerable activity, considerable movement of Russian forces throughout this area of northern Donetsk, as the Russians do what they always do: capture settlements, cut off roads, impede Ukrainian communications, soften up Ukrainian troops in order to storm these cities. My impression, by the way, is that the Russians are probably in a position to storm Siversk. The fact that they haven't done so is not because they cannot do so. I think that if the Russians had been focused on simply taking Siversk, they would have done it 2 days ago. I think it is because the Russians are more focused on disrupting and defeating Ukrainian military deployments in this area of northern Donetsk region. And the military summary channel has said that the main battle, the first page of the battle for Slavyansk-Kramatorsk has now been written, in effect, that all this fighting that we see is rather like the fighting that we saw around Severodonetsk, Lysychansk in May and June, that what this is all doing is preparing for that final culminating battle against Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And here I completely agree with what the military summary channel says. It seems to me that we are now very, very close to the final big battle within the larger battle of Donbass. And how long that's going to take, I am not going to try and guess, but I would suppose that the Russians would want it all over by the end of the summer. Now, that now brings us to various rumours that are circulating, and which, by the way, were also very eruditely and intelligently discussed by the military summary channel as well. There are now rumours that the Russians, that Putin is indeed going to make a final offer to the Western powers, and that this offer will perhaps be formally published before Slavyansk and Kramatorsk fall, but after Bakhmut, Soledar, Siversk, all of these places fall. And the essence of this proposal, which apparently has already been communicated to Western governments through intermediaries, the presidents of, specifically the presidents of Serbia and Brazil, is that the Russians will clear Donetsk region, or that the Ukrainians should pull out of the remainder of Donetsk region, and then the front lines should freeze. In other words, there should be no more fighting beyond that, no counteroffensive in Kherson region or anything like that, that the Russians in effect be left in full control of the Donbass, of the areas of Zaporozhye and Kharkiv region that they control, and of Kherson region, and that there should be no impeding of the referendums that are due to take place in all of these places for their prospective union with Russia. Now, that's not going to be the only part of this proposal. There are certain to be demands about Ukraine's Ukrainian neutrality, about Ukraine not entering NATO, and I personally suspect that there's also going to be continuing demands about demilitarization and the purging from what's left of Ukraine of its militant ideology. So, but the territorial lines proposed by this offer will basically freeze the front lines once Donbass is taken by the Russians, which realistically now can only be a few weeks away at most. Now, as I said, Western governments undoubtedly already know the details of these proposals, as do the Ukrainians. And I'm going to make a quick observation. We're now, I think, in that stage in this war when the Russians are making proposals to the Western powers and to the Ukrainians, which they probably know that the Western powers and the Ukrainians are going to refuse. And I say that because the Western powers have, in effect, trapped themselves. If they consented to this demand that the Russians were making, if they told Ukraine to adhere, to accept these demands that the Russians are making, and in effect to end the war with Kherson region, most of Zaporozhye, all of the Donbass, parts of Kharkiv, irretrievably lost to Ukraine, well, this would be incredibly difficult to sell to Western publics politically. After all, we've had endless rhetoric from Western governments about the fact that Russia must not be allowed to benefit from its aggression. So surrendering territory, even though there are some people in the West of a more realistic disposition who seem to be prepared to accept that this is most likely what's going to happen, telling Ukraine, demanding of Ukraine that it accept this, is going to be politically, I would have thought, all but impossible. So the Russians are almost certainly making this offer, anticipating that the Western powers are going to refuse it. In which case, as the military summary channel also said, there is, following the fall of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, no real obstacle left for the Russians between Donbass and the Dnieper River. And it's not just that the Russians would in that case capture all of Ukraine, essentially, east of the Dnieper, but that they would also be taking places like Poltava and of course Kharkiv and Zaporozhye as well. And cities like Kremenchuk and Dnipro will become at that point frontline cities in what will probably at that point also be a continuing war. So I think that this is probably, almost certainly, one of those devices that happens sometimes in war, where one side makes a proposal, it appears on the face of it completely reasonable, in the knowledge though that however reasonable it may appear to be, the other side is going to reject it, thereby consolidating within the country itself that's waging the war, in this case Russia, consolidating political support within the country for the war and solidifying international support for the war as well. And of course Russia has now essentially won the battle of narratives in the global south, in places like India, Saudi Arabia, Latin America, wherever, about this war, and they will want to hold on to that advantage, which makes it important for them to appear to be reasonable. And I think that is what the Russians are going to do. By the way, I'm going to say something else, which is that this is not by any means new or unusual in wars. An absolute master at this kind of thing, of making what on the face of it were extremely reasonable proposals in the full knowledge that the other side would reject them, thereby enabling the war to continue, was Abraham Lincoln during the American Civil War. I'm not going to go into the details of his various peace proposals at various times, but he was making them on a fairly regular basis, but they were always pitched at a level where it was all but inconceivable that the South would ever accept them. And essentially, that is what I think the Russians are going to be doing now. Now, whilst I'm on the topic of what the Russians are about to do, I should make a further point, which is that yesterday and over the last couple of days, we'd been getting a whole flood of reports that the 15th of July was going to be a day of enormous significance. Putin was meeting with the Security Council. In fact, he did meet with the Security Council on the 15th of July. The Duma was going to meet an emergency session on the 15th of July. A big announcement supposedly was coming. Except it wasn't. Now, I don't know why, whether perhaps we've all read the tea leaves wrong. I mean, we do. Sometimes I certainly do. I would have done in this case. Maybe there was no actual plan for some great announcement. Or maybe somebody in Moscow thought that there was a possibility that Siversk and Bakhmut and Soledar would fall before the 15th of July, and that is why the timing the timing of these meetings was scheduled then, but that for various reasons, Ukrainian resistance being rather stiffer than expected, or logistical problems, or who knows what, that the decision was made to postpone the announcements by a little. I suspect that it is the latter, and that the big announcement is going to be this peace offer that I've talked about, except of course, as I said, that it's a peace offer that the Western powers are almost certain to reject. Now, the Military Summary Channel made what I think is the key point about this offer, and with which I am in wholehearted agreement. If the peace offer is refused, if the war goes on, the Russians have now made it very clear that they're going to hold referendums in the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic, and also almost certainly in Kherson region, and perhaps in Zaporozhye, the parts of Zaporozhye and Kharkiv that they control, which will pave the way for the union of these territories with Russia. Now, at that point, these territories, in Russian eyes, become territories of the Russian Federation, of Russia itself. And the citizens of these regions become Russian citizens. At that point, any Ukrainian offensive or counteroffensive or missile strike or bombing strike or battle against these places becomes, from a Russian point of view, a Ukrainian attack on Russian territory. And that, of course, leaves open the possibility of Russia using that to exert much more of its military power in Ukraine than it has been doing up to now. The Russians would say that their country is now under direct attack. The limited military operation which they claim to be undertaking in Ukraine would no longer, therefore, be adequate for the situation, because the Russians were not sending a force into another country in order to defend the people of that country from... Remember, the Russians recognized the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. At that point, when that has changed and all these places are part of Russia, the Russians would say this is no longer a case of our army fighting in another country. It is now a case of our country itself defending its borders. And then, of course, and this is what I think the president of Serbia meant when he said that all hell would break loose, then, of course, the Russians would probably say that they're justified in stepping up their campaign in Ukraine in order to bring it to a conclusion, which would probably leave very little or anything of Ukraine left at the end, at the conclusion of the war. It's very much, by the way, in keeping with the way that Putin likes to act. As I've said many times about Putin, he is a lawyer and he likes to prepare his actions. He likes to prepare his steps carefully so that he can at least provide himself with legal justification for all of them. You may dispute the validity of that legal justification. You may consider it entirely spurious, but it is what Putin likes to do, and one of the reasons why he likes to do it, and it's not just because he's a lawyer himself, but because it makes it easier for him to justify and explain what he's doing to the leaders of other states, to China first and foremost, to India, to Iran perhaps, to North Korea, which has just recognized, by the way, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, to various other countries around the world which have shown sympathy to Russia in this conflict. So instead of making a straight dash to the Dnieper, he's going to make this peace offer. He knows almost certainly that the Western powers will reject this peace offer. At that point, the war will continue. He'll be able, once the referendums are out of the way, to say that he's now defending Russian territory and the integrity and security of Russian citizens. And that gives him carte blanche to move deeper and further into Ukraine. And that, I think, is probably the game plan. Now, there is, it seems to me, a clear choice for the Western powers to make in this situation. And it's the choice, the correct decision, is for them to do what Putin, neither Putin nor I, though I suspect most people, expect them to do. And what might provoke huge anger amongst the more nationalist-minded in Ukraine, but in fact to accept Putin's offer and to tell the Ukrainians to do so as well. I say that because it's the only way, it seems to me, of both avoiding an even larger war, and also not just a larger war, but importantly a war which, as I've said previously, is going to result in Ukraine effectively being destroyed. Putin has already given a warning. He gave a warning. I discussed it some time ago in a program that I made. He said that it's going to become ever harder to negotiate with the Russians the longer this goes on, and that the Russians haven't even properly started yet. If this proposal that I suspect he's going to make is refused, then I think he will feel that he has gone as far as he needs to go with negotiations. It will just be a case from that point on of war. We'll no longer have a special military operation. It'll be a straightforward war. And at that point, the Russians will be able to advance all the way to the Dnieper and do whatever Putin decides they need to do in order to bring Ukraine to heel. Now, I can't see how that serves Western interests. I would have thought that far better to swallow one's pride, to lose some face, to make this deal with the Russians that will again preserve some part of Ukraine, including, importantly, some parts of Ukraine east of the Dnieper. I don't expect the Americans to do this. Firstly, we've had more defiant statements from the French, and we've had comments now from a senior French official, who, by the way, I strongly suspect is Emmanuel Macron himself, in which we hear again talk about France supporting Ukraine until it achieves victory, which even includes retaking Crimea. A fantastic, ludicrous idea. And the other thing, which the Military Summary Channel correctly highlighted, is that the US Embassy in Kiev has now raised its alert status and has given instructions for all US citizens in Ukraine to leave Ukraine immediately. Now, as the Military Summary Channel correctly said, this was something that the US Embassy did in the run-up to the war, and the US Embassy then and the US Embassy now is apparently transferring some of its most important functions from Kiev to Lviv. So that suggests that the US is also anticipating some bigger Russian offensive, and that seems to be consistent with the actions and the statements that the US Embassy in Kiev is making. So it looks as if, unfortunately, the Western powers are not going to heed my advice. Well, I'm no doubt that they won't. Obviously, I'm under no illusions. I don't delude myself that they're listening to anything that I say or even aware of the things that I'm saying. But I said what I think. I've never understood the logic of fighting to the point of defeat instead of trying to negotiate a deal when one can. I think this will be the last opportunity for a deal. But anyway, there we are. That's, I think, where all this is now heading. Unfortunately, it's not just a case now of war in Ukraine. President Biden of the United States has been in Saudi Arabia, is now in Saudi Arabia, and as I said, he's recently been in Israel, and he signed there a statement with the Israeli government, which said that the United States and Israel would ensure that Iran never acquired a nuclear weapon, and I think, extremely dangerous commitment to make, and one which, to my mind, leaves open now the very real possibility of an Israeli strike against Iran. There's been a recent development which fills me with concern, and that is that Saudi Arabia has now announced that it is opening its airspace for commercial airline traffic from Israel. Now, on the face of it, that doesn't seem particularly concerning. Israel and Saudi Arabia have not yet signed a peace agreement. Most people think eventually they will, but so far they haven't. But it's known that relations between these two countries are actually fairly cordial. They have many of the same enemies, Iran, for example, and it's not perhaps on the face of it surprising that Saudi Arabia has just opened its airspace to commercial airline traffic from Israel. Except, of course, that there has to be a worry that this isn't just commercial airline traffic that we're talking about. It could be that Saudi Arabia is now about to open its airspace, or has in fact quietly informed Israel that it is opening its airspace to facilitate an Israeli airstrikes against Iran. In other words, to enable the Israeli Air Force to overfly Saudi Arabia on their way to Iran. In that case, we are heading towards a war in the Middle East. A war in the Gulf. All at a time when, as I said, oil prices are already extremely high. They've dipped a few days ago. They've now risen again. As of the time of making this video, Brent crude is again trading over $100 a barrel. But anyway, we've seen these ups and downs in the oil price, but overall it's a lot higher than it was, and it is fueling inflation in that kind of a way. And yet, a war is about to be started, or so it seems to me, in the most important oil producing region, and that quite possibly in the run up to winter. Bear in mind that already we're talking about a severe energy crisis in Europe this winter. I cannot imagine worse timing to do this sort of thing. But it seems that's precisely where we are going. It does beg this question, yet again, who is in charge in Washington, and who is making these extraordinary and very reckless decisions? Well, thank you for joining me again today for this program. I look forward to you joining me again, both on this channel and indeed on the Duran. And of course, many of you will now be aware that my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou cannot appear on the Duran or on his own channel for a couple more days because of a decision taken by our friends, which I'm not at liberty to talk about in detail, say that it relates to an event that took place a year and a half ago. It's important to say again that Alex continues to produce output with the same drive and energy and humour that he has always shown. You can find his programs on Locals, on our Locals channel, all of our programs on the Locals channel, but Alex's programs there, and they also appear on Rumble and above all on our Telegram channel, and you can find them too on ODYSEE and in other places. So Alex hasn't gone away, he's still producing content, it's just that you can't find it on YouTube. Now, let me repeat again what I've said in previous programs. What is given can clearly be taken away. This can be done to any of us at any time. I'm not anticipating or saying that it will, but it could happen. If you want to watch our programs and be sure that you will always receive them, then do consider signing up on our other platforms. Locals perhaps being the most approachable one. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about that. You can also support our work if you wish via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also you can support it by going to our shop, buying the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, all those great things. And last but not least, please don't forget to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's all from me today. Thank you again for joining me. More from me soon, and have a very good day until we speak again.